when I was, involved in student Christian organizing, and when I was working with people who came out of the progressive wing, or progressive departments, I guess is maybe better, in progressive movements within the church and the ecumenical and the multi-faith movement, it wasn't like we sat around a table saying, well, okay, I have to translate their faith-based approach to this problem into my materialist approach. No. I mean, we were talking about concrete analysis of concrete conditions, and it was, you just felt you were in a room full of comrades, to use that word. There was just we might have had different approaches to some of those things, but I mean, I have different approaches with people, within the party, people take different approaches to things, and that's why we have, meetings and discussions. I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice, meaning that instead of having a preoccupation with are you an atheist or are you a believer or a faith-based person, the materialism sort of says, are we going to look at the conditions that are happening around us, try to figure out what's going on, try to figure out the best way to address them, and to find a path that can build a movement to confront these and change them. I never felt that the Christians I was working with had any different approach than that.
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean, a Catholic PhD student in philosophy at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, where I study Christian things appropriately related to my institution.
Yeah, legit. I'm Matt. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois. My research interests are media archaeology, cultural theory, Christianity, leftist politics, and I'm still knee-deep in trolls over here. Really good news on the Trolls front. Last week I said that it would be until 2020 until the Trolls 2 came out, but here's the really great news, that there will be a Trolls holiday episode on Netflix in December.
That's what I'm talking about.
So I am ecstatic about that fact.
That's great. I see what you mean earlier when you said knee deep in trolls, because I thought, well, that would actually take a lot of trolls, but it turns out there are a lot of trolls.
Millions
to get up to your knees.
Millions of them all over my knees.
Yeah, that's good. I feel like they should do a remake of the kids trolls, but using like Lord of the Rings trolls, like just disgusting, slobbery beasts, forming primitive societies.
Yeah, that sounds good. Or like
that's the movie I want.
Harry Potter trolls are the kind of same way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, someone needs to write us an email and explain to us how big, massive, gross trolls became tiny, adorable, large-haired trolls.
Yeah, I'd love to know.
You're the media archaeology guy here.
Yeah, I don't know. There is actually this really good essay. Okay, well, don't let me unleash all of this in this podcast. But there's this really good essay. So there's this guy. I think I cannot remember his nationality. Not that it's that important. His name is Erki Hatamo, and he does this thing called topos studies in the history of media. So he looks for like the themes and variations in technology over a period of time. He has this one essay that is actually about the appearance of like tiny people in film and like in advertising. So maybe it's just another emergence of that kind of thing. I'd have to look into it, but it's a thing. It's a topos. So.
We'll report back next week. We'll find out.
Yeah, man, I need to get into this troll stuff.
Well, today on the show we are not talking about trolls. Sorry to disappoint all you troll heads out there, all you big hairs. Instead, we're talking with Dave McKee, who is the provincial leader of the Communist Party of Canada here in Ontario. But before we do that, we don't have any iTunes reviews, tragically. And as punishment, you have to listen to us talk about another political compass quiz that we took. So we figured out what we would be in the Russian Revolution last week. Turns out I'm a Bolshevik. Matt's a left socialist revolutionary. So we decided to figure out what we would be if we weren't in Russia. And the results were surprising.
The results will astound you.
So we took this quiz. It's a Specker, S-P-E-K-R. It's a series of poorly conceived political axioms that you thumbs up or thumbs down.
Yeah, it's not great.
And
not great
no,
questions.
In fact, it is bad. But I ended up being a libertarian socialist, which was a surprise to me.
Yeah, that doesn't seem quite right. I mean, you were a Bolshevik last week, and this week you're a libertarian socialist, so that's strange.
Yeah, who knows what I'll be next week.
Yeah, and I got pegged as a democratic socialist, not in the DSA sense, but like in the real sense. Sorry, DSA.
Not in the Democratic Socialists of America sense.
No, but like in the real not Bernie Sanders sense, I guess is kind of what I mean. The description on the website is: you support light restrictions on cultural reform and maximum restrictions on economic freedom. You oppose all private property rights and all uses of money, as well as the abolition of the state. Yeah, that's all good stuff. I do support all that stuff. That's good.
Yeah, I don't know what happened exactly as I was answering these questions. I think the thing that these kinds of tests really suffer from, one of the things, is it's hard to tell if you're answering a kind of utopic question or like an immediately pragmatic question. So they'll have a question that'll be like, do you think the government should provide, I don't know, like welfare programs? It's like, well, like right now, I guess that would be nice, but like in the future, I don't know, abolish the state. Like we'll see. What I don't know. What like when are we talking here? This isn't Russia.
Yeah, and they're also, I don't know. I'm starting to think that these political compass tests are the exact opposite of real leftist praxis, because they're asking about all these like sort of ideal situations, and that doesn't seem to actually help. Like there was one specifically that was I remember thinking like, this is so weird. There's a question that was like, should individuals be able to associate in cooperatives or communes?
Yeah, right.
And if you answered thumbs down, that moved you to the left.
Right.
And if you said thumbs up, it moved you to the right. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense at all, because it should be the other way around.
Yeah, exactly.
And in fact, okay, so you guys that don't know all the behind the scenes stuff, Dean and I are both reading this book on Fidel Castro and religion. And there's actually this.
It's extremely good.
Yeah, it's
by the way.
so good. Oh my gosh, I'm like all about Fidel. Fidel's my guy right now. Anyways, there's this part in the book where he's explaining how he's explaining to this journalist that there are still like private farms in Cuba. Well, there were in the 80s, and they have the ability to like band together into cooperatives, and they even do. So like I don't know, there's an example of that exact thing in a real communist sort of setting, and it's confused in this test. It's super weird that I'm more authoritarian than you though this week. That doesn't seem.
It is weird.
Doesn't seem right.
No, I don't think so. I think it is wrong, in fact. But my favorite thing is, so you can go at the end of the test. It's like, hey, what is and then whatever your result is, and then the test will explain it to you. But underneath that, there's a question of why this spec. Apparently, spec is the branding they're using here, and it says, if you click on it, it says if you responded to all the statements on the quiz truthfully and without mistake, then based on your responses, it was only logical to be spec'd the way that you did. And it goes on to just make the most brutally ideological, closed-off perception of itself. This isn't really a sentence, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
It's just like over and over. It's like, well, this is just how it is. Like you say yes and no, and then this is what you are if you're honest. And my favorite part is at the end of it. It says, if you think that Specker has mistakenly assigned you a spec to which you do not identify, like me, you have two options. Number one, examine your political opinions to determine whether they align with your result and change them accordingly in order to maintain your personal integrity. Or two, take the quiz again and respond dishonestly to get the result you want. And that is not exaggerated. That's what it says.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's what you have to do according to the immortal science of Specker.orgism.
That's right. I gotta go back and be dishonestly Marxist this time.
This is like such a dumb thing, though. It's like completely just only what you think of these like weird scenarios they keep giving you, and not what anyone probably thinks about in terms of praxis.
Yeah, my favorite one, there was a question that was like, do you think that parents have a right to abuse and neglect their children, or do you think that there should be intervention? And that's it. Like, what's the nature of that intervention? Who knows? What's the abuse look like? Who knows? But I can't imagine somebody promoting it, I guess. I don't know. Like, who's like, yeah, totally, they should have that right.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess anarcho-capitalists, I suppose. That's it.
I guess.
Yeah,
that's true.
Yeah, that's true though. The not specifying exactly what type of intervention is a problem. Like, if you're a parent and you abuse or neglect your child, like, you get yelled at. Like, that's it? Or like what? Oh man.
Yeah. They also have a whole section on anarchism, and they like have all these questions about anarcho-capitalism. And first of all, that's a contradiction in terms. There is no such thing as that. Anarchism is anti-capitalist. Sorry, the end. But also, it does lead me to believe that there are some real ideological motivations for this political compass.
Yeah, for real. Okay, so if you guys want, well, we told you the answers to this this weird quiz. So if you want to go check out yours and let us know on Twitter where it is that you fall in there. Are you an anarcho-capitalist? Are you a right-wing fascist? Or are you somewhere on that bottom left quadrant? So like, tweet us and let us know, I guess. I'd be interested in hearing everyone's weird answers.
Yeah, definitely a good excuse to do another Christian leftist roll call.
Oh, yeah.
Who's out there.
For real.
So we also took a theological compass quiz, but to figure out which medieval theologian we would be. And I got Hildegard of Bingen. What did you get, Matt?
Yeah, same. We're in the same place there. That's funny.
Yeah, it's good. She's very cool. There's a class at ICS about her right now.
Legit.
The description is Hildegard was a rebel. She was probably the first female theologian to be really taken seriously. Well, I don't know about that, but
probably
she was
not
very cool.
True, yeah.
Yeah. She was the doctor, a visionary, a composer, and an artist, in addition to proto-feminist. So there you go. Quality stuff.
Yeah, for sure. All that good stuff.
We look forward to your letters about why that's bad news. Some real angry trads. So we really should have had Dave McKee do these tests, I feel like, before we interviewed him. Just to find out. I would really like to know what theologian he would be.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Fun. We should have people do these. That'd be fun.
We should. All right. We should think about that. But we should also stop taking them, so please send us iTunes reviews, or else we're going to have to keep punishing you with these personality quizzes, and they're just going to get worse, I got to tell you. I mean, we put the best ones at the top, so bottom of the barrel personality quizzes don't sound like a thing anybody wants to get to.
So give us those reviews, please.
Please. All right, let's turn it over to Dave. Yeah, we can just start out with what have you been up to, Dave? What did you do today? What are you doing for work? How's it going?
Well, today's been pretty good. I actually just I had a French class this morning. I take French class once a week, so we talked in French as best we could about the situation of sexual harassment. Actually, that's I think people were thinking about the Harvey Weinstein news. And they wanted to talk about that. So, I learned all kinds of new vocabulary. But, so that was interesting. So then, I popped into the office for an hour and then came here. So
cool.
Mostly I'll be doing a lot of admin work today, I think. So
nice.
Yeah. How about you guys?
What have you been up to, Matt?
Lot of teaching still. A few nights ago, I went to a concert with my friend of the show, John Birmingham. We went to go see a band called The World is a Beautiful Place, and I Am No Longer Afraid to Die. It's a post-rock band. We went to go see them. It was cool, but we were the oldest people at the concert, so that was less cool. Just there amongst all the kids, so that was fun.
Nice. Cool. That's cool. This Sunday, I went to a white supremacy, or anti-white supremacy rally, to be clear, in Queen's Park in Toronto, and that was pretty cool. pretty exciting stuff. Communist Party of Canada was there. Yeah, chatted with some folks for a bit there.
It was a big rally, wasn't it?
It was big.
Yeah.
I'm pretty bad at judging crowd sizes, but definitely hundreds of people.
Excellent. Yeah, it looked good on the screen.
Yeah.
It was good.
Yeah. So that rally was cool.
Well, that rally must have been cool because whenever you were posting a ton on Facebook after that, so I know you had a very positive experience.
That's right. Yeah, I never post on Facebook, so if I do, it's just some real inspiration to the spirit there.
Something stood out. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
That's good. Yeah, it's nice to see people moving into action in such a good response. With such a broad response too, right?
That's right.
Lots of different communities.
It's cool too to see it in Canada because, being an American living abroad, I don't know. Sometimes you kind of feel like, what am I going to do? How am I going to express that I don't like something going on in my country? Right. And then to come here and then have people who are also like, well, this is actually a problem everywhere. So it's like a nice way of feeling, connected to. Problems of injustice around the world and building those kind of solidarity links. That's neat.
Definitely. Yeah. That's good.
Yeah, that's cool.
So Dave, we wanted to have you on the show for a while, actually. I chatted with you at the Communist Karaoke night a long time ago about just Christianity and your experiences a little bit and, what the party is up to and that sort of thing.
Sure.
So, Matt and I figured, well, we've got a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. We should probably get a guy who knows a little bit about that and is actually, working hard with organized politics in Toronto to figure it out. So,
well, thanks for inviting me. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah. So maybe just to start, Dave, could you just tell us a little bit about the Communist Party of Canada? I mean, what makes it unique among other left parties in Canada? What's kind of its general history? And, why does Canada need one?
There you go. Well, the CPC, Communist Party of Canada, was formed in 1921, and it was inspired, the formation was inspired by the Russian Revolution, or the October Revolution, which is actually celebrating its 100th anniversary this next month. And it was interesting because at the time in Canadian history on the labor and the left, there was an awful lot of activity all around the country, but it tended to be fractured and fragmented, sometimes on a sectoral basis, like maybe resource workers instead of the trades or the industrial trades, or often it was fragmented on a geographic basis. So you had groups in Alberta, you had groups in Ontario, groups in the East, and there was a number of different ideological tendencies that were moving around. So one of the groups that was quite strong at the time was the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, which still exists. They were more of a syndicalist or an anarchist type of organization, but then there were others. There were some that were allied with what we would now look at probably as the Liberal Party type of politics in the Canadian context. There were others who would be... there was just a whole range of different ideological and organizational principles that were at play. And after the Russian Revolution in 1917, and this happened all over the world, it wasn't unique to Canada, but there was what Tim Buck, who was a longtime party leader, referred to as a thunderclap, and he said it just gripped people. It was it was a new event. It was the first time in history that workers had seized control and deliberately gone about building a different kind of society. And so this kind of this thunderclap that Tim Buck talks about is what led to the formation of the Communist Party of Canada. It's continued through, a lot of history and some very great moments and some very challenging moments. Right now, we're not a big party at the moment. We're a small party. But I think one of the things that makes it different among the left, one element is that we participate alongside other tactics, we participate in elections. And most of the political left in Canada, outside of the NDP, doesn't do that. The NDP, sorry for Matt's sake, New Democratic Party, Social Democratic Party.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. So the CP has, we participate in elections, although it's not an electoralist party. We don't see that as the sort of single path to seeking change, and we don't really hold to the idea that you can actually elect socialism. I mean, there is, because of the nature of capitalism, because of the nature of class society, you do need to have a revolutionary rupture with that. It doesn't have to be violent necessarily, and we don't promote that in our program, but we also don't see that just simply working through the ballot box is sufficient. That said, one of the other things I think that, and to me this is maybe the big thing that differentiates the Communist Party from other left groups, is that we see a connection between the struggle for immediate reforms and the ultimate struggle, or ultimate maybe sounds a little grand, but the broader struggle for revolutionary change. It's through those struggles for immediate reforms, whether that's childcare or jobs or expanded healthcare, whatever, any range of issues. Fighting for those reforms is enormously important for two reasons. One, it actually helps people in the immediate term and it addresses their immediate needs. But also in that struggle, people tend to become more politicized. They learn more about the nature of the system that we live in. They learn over time, not automatically, but over time, they learn more about its limitations and then ultimately about the need to have a more radical approach and ultimately a revolutionary approach in order to safeguard the gains that we've won, but also to expand on those gains. And an interesting example right now might be in Venezuela, for example, where there was, years ago there was an election of Hugo Chavez, and as there's been an increasing pushback from the forces of the oligarchy in Venezuela, combined with wealthy and transnational corporations in the United States and Canada and elsewhere, as that pushback has happened, we've seen that the people in Venezuela have become not homogeneously, but a large section of them has become much more radicalized because they see that they can only get so far without having more radical and ultimately more systemic change. So it's this connection of reform and revolution that I think is one of the strategic and tactical differences between the CP and a number of other left groups. Right now, so I'm the leader of the Ontario Party, and right now we're actually gearing up for our provincial election, which is going to happen next June 7th, 2018. So we're beginning to identify candidates. We're beginning to, we've adopted our long platform. Now we have the task of making it into something that's shorter and, more easy to distribute. That's one of the tasks that we're looking at. And the other campaign that we're working on right now in Ontario is a province-wide housing campaign. That's been going on, since the spring, I guess we started that campaign. And in that campaign, we're looking at agitating for a lot more publicly built and publicly owned, publicly controlled affordable housing, alongside a lot of legislative change that would not just freeze rents, but roll them back, because there's been this long period in Ontario, not just Ontario, but that's my area of responsibility. There's been this extended period where there's been not a lot of affordable housing supply built, and also rents have risen at a very high rate and continuous rate. And so people are in a position now where there's there's 725,000 families or households rather across Ontario that are in what's called core housing need. This is a statistical category that basically means they're spending more than 30% of their household income on housing that is also insufficient. So it's in need of major repairs, or it's crowded, this kind of thing. So 725,000 households, I don't know how many people that is, but if it's going to be upwards of 1.5 million people, exactly. And so that's been a lot of we've done a lot of other things in the recent period, but those are our two, ongoing and central preoccupations at the moment.
Cool, Dave. Thanks for sharing that with us. It sounds like you guys have a lot on your plate in terms of work to do. So the Communist Party of Canada is a communist party. Can you tell us a little bit about the ideological underpinnings of the party? Like, are you guys a Marxist-Leninist party or something else?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So we are a Marxist-Leninist party. We're not, that would be different from, say, a Trotskyist party or a Maoist party, or, there's different names that people use, but those would be the main, the main other versions. Historically, the CPC was among the world parties that were associated with the Soviet Union, as opposed to, say, China. Now, currently, we have a new international grouping. It was formed, I think, in the mid to late 90s, and it's called the International Meeting of Communist and Workers' Parties. That's mostly the parties who were historically associated with the Soviet Union, but it also now increasingly includes parties who had other international connections, but who've they've moved. Their orientation has perhaps developed, or maybe developed is a bit arrogant, but has evolved or changed a little bit, as has the views of some of the parties within the international meeting process. So when I say we're Marxist-Leninists, so that means there's a particular set of political analyses that we use, and there's also some organizational principles that we follow. The political analysis is I guess, fairly straightforward. I mean, most people tend to be more familiar with that side of it. So it's Marxist. We look at class issues. We look at, we're heavily preoccupied with capitalism and the class relations and social relations that emerge from that, and how that connects to other areas of oppression. So, for example, racism, patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, ableism. How does class society use and reproduce those different types of oppressions? And also looking at things like the other social issues. So, for example, climate change and the environment is a really, it's an increasing preoccupation with many, many people. And equally, within the communist movement, it's becoming a much more increasing preoccupation, which is good. So we will try to approach that issue and those others from the point of view of class society without being class reductionist, which also people tend to hear about within Marxist circles, where people sometimes say, well, we're not going to talk about women's equality because that's not class. And I mean, that would be a class reductionist approach. We don't follow that point of view. We would argue that, these are real oppressions. They have a real impact on society, on people in it. And it is part of how capitalism produces and reproduces itself. And so we have to be really cognizant of it. We have to recognize it, and we have to figure out how to confront it in a mass way. So that's kind of the Marxist, in a real tiny nutshell. That's sort of the Marxist idea. The Leninist part includes more of the organizational principles of the party, as well as some political principles. So the political principles would be Lenin and the Bolshevik Party did a lot of theoretical work, a lot of writing about issues of imperialism. What is it? What isn't it? What does it mean to the working class in specific countries? What does it mean to the working class worldwide? There was also a lot of writing at that time about national equality and national inequality, and how do we understand class unity on the basis of national equality. So that also comes from Marx, but a lot of it also does come from Lenin. The other thing, though, that Lenin wrote about was the notion of the party, a communist party, or what's sometimes called a vanguard party. And that can be a tricky notion for people. When you talk about a vanguard party, generally what you're talking about is the political leadership of the working class and its allies. And often it comes off as very arrogant. If I were to walk into a room full of workers and say, "Oi, listen up, I'm from the vanguard," they'd probably turn their ears off pretty quickly. And they should, right? I mean, it's not about me declaring we're the vanguard. That's kind of beyond simplistic. It's about recognizing the need for political leadership and then organizing to win that political leadership. And that has to be won and re-won and re-won all the time, right? Through a struggle, whatever stage that struggle's at, if it's in a revolutionary phase or if it's in a pre-revolutionary phase, which we certainly are in Canada and the United States as well. We're not in a revolutionary situation. But there's still a need for political leadership. There's still a need for organizations to come together and analyze the concrete situations, come up with tactical proposals, and take those, test those basically in the struggle of the working class and the people. And then to revisit those and evaluate them. It's sort of a constant dynamic dialogue in a sense. That's a little simplistic, but it's a constant dynamic process between the party and its engagement with all of the forces for progressive change. The other principle that sometimes confuses people about a Marxist-Leninist party is the organizational principle we call democratic centralism. It's a bit jargony, but in essence what it means is that at any given moment, you need to combine the maximum possible discussion and input and democracy with a united decision and action. And so, I don't know, say you're coming up with, we're coming up to an election, so we have to come up with a platform. So we have our convention, we discuss the platform there, and then we vote on it. And once we've voted on it and agreed to that general platform, it's incumbent upon all party members to follow it. So I can't go charging off and say, well, our policy is for around healthcare, for example, is to expand it to include eye care and pharmacare and some other things. I would be in the wrong if I went out and said, well, actually, it's fine that big pharma controls all the pharmaceuticals and nobody gets public pharmacare in this country or in this province. That's okay. If I were to say that, I would be pretty seriously violating the party's decisions, which were democratically made. And chances are I'd have, I'd be called in for a meeting with some people to talk about, you're on the wrong side of our policy here, and you gotta not do that. I like to compare democratic centralism with a process that most people are more familiar with, which would be, say, a strike vote in a union. If you have a vote on a final contract offer, you need to have the maximum discussion on that offer so that people can ask all the questions they want. They can point out the good and the bad. They can try to identify any pitfalls that are in the language or any doublespeak, for example. They can try and convince, and they should try to convince one another of their view. If I think it's a crummy contract offer, it's incumbent upon me to speak to it and say, look, I think we have to turn this down for this reason. And similarly, if I think it's a pretty good contract, I should be saying, we can live with this and we can build on this, and here's why. So that's the democratic part. And then the union has a vote, right? You have a vote on that offer, and it's on that offer. It's not on any different version of it, because that's concrete. And at that vote, at the time of that vote, wherever you are, you have a choice to make. If I think it's a terrible deal and everybody else votes for it, well, I'm pretty much bound by it unless I quit the job, and similarly, if I think it's a good deal, but everybody else votes to turn it down, I have to make a decision. Am I going to be bound by this? And if I am bound by it, I'm going to be picketing with my coworkers. If I'm not bound by it, well, I've got a choice. I can either leave, or I could be a scab, which politically is, of course, repugnant. So, wouldn't do that. But I find it useful sometimes to use that example because it's something that people are a lot more familiar with, and it helps. And it really is very, very similar. It's not identical, but it's very similar to the principle of democratic centralism and how it works in a communist party. You need a collective decision-making process, and if it's going to mean something, you have to have some way of carrying it out. Otherwise, those decisions don't really mean very much if it's all for one. Or not all for one, but each person for themselves. So I don't know if that kind of gets at some of your question.
Yeah, that's good. Can I ask one follow-up? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So you were a few minutes ago, you were talking about like the Vanguard Party and how that functions. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that. So before we started recording, I mentioned that last night I taught a class on Marx, and it went some interesting ways. So there's one part that we talked about in class for quite a bit that I'd love to hear you talk about, being in an actual communist party. So in the second part of the manifesto, it's the part that's titled "Proletarians and Communists." Marx says that the communists do not form a separate party opposed to the working class. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. And being a party that is Marxist-Leninist and being a party that has to deal with this sort of vanguard idea a little bit, how do you all see yourselves expressing the interests of, I don't know, proletariat might not be the right exact word, but of working class people as a whole in Canada and Toronto or Ontario specifically?
No, that's a good question. And maybe I'll start by just saying, like, the Communist Party is, in our own program, in our constitution, we actually sort of reference that quote or that formulation from the manifesto that you talk about. We say we are a party of the working class and we have no interests outside of that. The party isn't just made up of working class people, though. I mean, there's it's a combination of workers, intellectuals, who you could argue are also part of the working class. There's people who have their own business. There's not many, but I mean, it tends to be rooted in the working class. But it's the membership of the party isn't strictly limited to the working class, but its orientation is very much focused on the working class. And I guess there's one of the reasons for that, I guess the main reason we could say for that, has to do with our understanding of social relations within capitalism. That capitalism produces the working class, and that working class is also the means to overthrow or defeat capitalism and build something different. And that has to do, I won't go into all of that because we start to get into some theory, but basically it has to do with how capitalism generates social production. The working class people work together to make all of production, but the profit from that tends to be private. And that contradiction between social production and private profit is the that's the key tension in capitalist society. And so because we see the working class as being the singular group that has the capacity to lead that struggle against capitalism, that's why communist parties all over the world are focused on the working class. So what does that mean practically? Well, that's an excellent question. The working class in Canada is roughly 80 to 85% of the population. And so you can imagine that's not a homogeneous group. I mean, that's a lot of different income strata within that. There's a lot of different there's different ethnic groups, there's different language groups, there's all kinds of things that could potentially divide, but also all kinds of things that bring different points of view on working class experience. So the experience of, say, me, I used to work in a large newspaper print shop here in Toronto. So my experience as a manufacturing worker in a large urban center is very, very different from the experience of, say, a farm worker in rural Saskatchewan. And that's also very different from a logger in Northern Ontario or a fisher in BC. And so when we talk about being a party that's of the working class and oriented to the working class, part of that involves trying, and it can be hard, but making sure that you're gathering, that you're connecting with as many of those different elements and sectors of the working class as possible, and using that information to bolster a more robust understanding of the experience of the working class in contemporary capitalism in Canada now. And then out of that analysis, we work to identify different specific tactics for what are the key campaigns that we need to work on, and how do we want to work on those? What are the key demands? What are the key, what's the balance of forces here? What are the key organizations that we need to help build? So that I guess is a big part of it. The other part of it is we do seek to build alliances where practical between the working class and other sections of the population. So an example on that might be war and peace. Right now, the President of the United States is in a war of words, and a little bit more than just a war of words, very frightening posturing towards North Korea, towards the DPRK. And this has caused a lot more people to think about the potential of a regional war, even a nuclear war. And so that's not an issue for just the working class, right? I mean, a war is going to a war of that caliber wipes out entire cities and potentially entire civilizations. So when we're building the peace movement, our contribution to it would for sure to be to try to promote a sharper understanding of, for example, how imperialism affects the struggle for peace and how it affects militarism. But also tactically, we would seek to build the broadest possible unity of among the population in Canada. And that is going to include working class and unions, and it's also going to include small business and potentially wealthy people as well. And there's other examples like that. Other issues are you have less capacity to do that. If you were talking about legislation for, or pushing a campaign that was trying to make it easier for unions to organize new sections of the working class, you're probably pretty unlikely to find a whole lot of allies among the bourgeoisie. But, you might find allies among other, some sections of the population. So that maybe is a little bit of information on how we would approach that as a party that's rooted in the working class.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about what communist struggle looks like in Canada in particular. I mean, we've been talking about it already, and you've been giving a lot of interesting perspectives on it. I want to go back to something you said earlier about like violence and being in a revolutionary situation, and how the Communist Party of Canada isn't advocating for violence. It's trying to organize, nevertheless, for a kind of revolutionary, moment or something like that.
Right.
Could you just talk about that? I think a lot of people on the left and myself included, have a hard time thinking through those relationships between violence, revolution, and a different kind of society. So, what does the party think about all of that?
Oh, that's an excellent question, too. And I think it's one that a lot of people grapple with and ponder when they, come closer to the CP or even just come in contact with us. So, our goal, our aim is socialism, which, as I mentioned earlier, is you're going to build that out of a revolutionary rupture with capitalism. But in order to achieve that, and again, I mentioned this earlier, we see a connection between the struggle for immediate reforms and the struggle for revolutionary change. So our specific proposal is for what we call a people's coalition. That's the term that we use. I mean, it doesn't have to be that term, but that's just what we use. And what that would be, what we envision that to be, is a very deliberate movement of class and social forces who are willing to unite in a militant struggle around a common program. And that common program would be to confront and curb corporate power, the power of capitalism in particular, or its representatives in large corporations, and to fight for far-reaching economic, social, and political change. And so that would include things like a full employment policy, really, really massive expansion of social programs in the country, a very different foreign policy geared towards peace, international cooperation and solidarity, rather than towards competition and militarism and war. We would call for democratic reform. Specifically, we call for a version of proportional representation that's usually called mixed member proportional. We see that as much more democratic, much more responsive to local communities and to the electorate and to the residents. A whole series of different programmatic and platformy kind of policies that we push for. But the vehicle for doing that is what we call this People's Coalition, which would be a combination. And I think it's fair to say that we, at least in the current situation, we would see such a coalition forming in what we call the extra-parliamentary sphere. So, that's the social movements and political movements that are not represented in Parliament, that don't tend to run as political parties. That's the extra-parliamentary struggle. We think that's, in the current situation, that's the most decisive one. Ultimately, though, a people's coalition would grow to a point, we project, it would grow to a point where it was able to seek a parliamentary reflection. And that could be through its own specific party or through pressuring a special interest with a combination of other people. I mean, we try not to get terrifically prescriptive about the form of these things, but the trajectory of it is what we look at. So we have this People's Coalition that would fight for within the immediate context, the present context, for really radical reforms. Out of that, there would be, in all likelihood, a response from the ruling class. And this is what we see historically. We saw it in Chile, we saw it in Spain, we saw it we see it right now in Venezuela, and there's other examples too, where the ruling class, isn't really keen on giving up its power and its in society on any of those fronts, the social, political, or the economic front. And there tends to be a reaction to these types of progressive movements when they get to a point where they're actually fulfilling some comprehensive change. At that moment, or in those moments where there's a pushback, and it would likely be a severe pushback from the ruling class, and it's in all likelihood it will be allied with international forces like we see in Venezuela. At that moment, then those are the types of moments where the people in the working class need to make some decisions. How are they going to defend the gains that they've fought for and won through a people's coalition? And often in those moments, you end up seeing a much more a period of radicalization, a period of revolutionary consciousness moving through in a much larger way through the population. Even at those moments, it doesn't necessarily mean you're committed to a long drawn out or even a short civil war. But we never discount the possibility and the need to be prepared for such an eventuality. The reality is that in Canada and the US and most countries, you don't even have a large strike without having some form of picket line violence. Scabs rushing their way in buses and injuring workers on the picket line, and similarly those workers who are on the picket line defending their line, sometimes through more confrontational tactics, shall we say. We don't project the use of violence as the first or even the favored option. It's all it's costly. It costs your revolutionary movement. It costs the working class through destruction of, well, obviously loss of life, but also destruction of property, destruction of the means of production, which is the thing that we are trying to that the working class will have to seize if you're to build socialism. But at the same time, we caution against taking a naive approach, which would be to say that you can just convince the bourgeoisie. I mean, that's again maybe a bit jargon. You can convince the ruling class to just, that you've outnumbered them, that you've outmaneuvered them, that you've outbuilt, that your movement has built to a point where it's very powerful. In some cases, they may leave on their own accord, but it's very unlikely, and we feel it's always important to look at history, which tells us that you do have to be prepared for those more direct confrontations. But as I say, we would definitely work always to achieve those things in a way that avoids, as much as possible, avoids war. But we do have to maintain and what we've won, and we do have to build upon what we've won. So, and certainly in the current situation, in Canada and many countries, we're quite far from that type of conflict. We're at one of the people an older person in our party said once, if you think of a revolution as a bonfire, in Canada we're collecting firewood, and really that's that's sort of where we're at, right? And so it's so a lot of the work we do, we don't tend to dwell too much on what would happen. We try not to be really prescriptive about, here's our plan for socialism. In our program, we do talk about what we see as being key elements of working towards and then building socialism in Canada. But in our day-to-day, year-to-year work right now, we talk more about the need to build unity among the working class, the need to build that unity on the basis of equality, so gender equality, racial equality, national equality, for example. And that means that we end up moving into and trying to build more and more sophisticated movements to oppose those types of oppression, and ultimately that can lead to stronger unity of the working class in all of its different all of its diversity. That's kind of our work right now in the present. And so to do that, we end up working a lot on the struggle for peace and against militarism. We work a lot in the labor movement. We work a lot in anti-oppression struggles. We're working, for example, I mentioned in Ontario, we're working on the issue of housing. Right now, with NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement, being renegotiated, we're campaigning hard within the movements and organizations, and obviously the labor movement is a big part of that. Working hard to try and build and maintain working class unity against these capitalist free trade deals. So that's, I guess, the moment that we see ourselves as being in now. And as much as possible, we try to bring a stronger, more comprehensive analysis of the conditions that are leading to these struggles, and some clear tactics for finding a path not only through those individual struggles, but a path that can unite the movements, and move forward into a more radical struggle in general.
That's all really helpful, actually, just thinking about how social movements operate in Canada, and also how the party is trying to find its way with that. We've talked a little bit in the past about how, speaking of like history, where socialism has actually showed up, one thing that was really inspiring to you were Christian-based communities in Nicaragua. So I thought maybe we would talk a little bit about that, and I have a story that might be interesting to you. So at this rally against white supremacy this past weekend, I met a very kind evangelizing Trotskyite who was, just chatting me up about socialism. And somehow, I forget how it came up, but he asked something about why I was interested in communism. And I told him that I was probably going to go stand with the CPC. And so I said, well, I'm a Christian person, and I'm really formed by liberation theology and Christian movements in Latin America. And I could kind of just see on his face this moment of like polite kind of disgust, like, oh no, like you're one of those. And so he started talking to me about how, well, real materialist analysis, you really can't have religion, etc. And I said, well, historically, we've learned some different things about that. So I thought maybe I'd ask you about your experience with religion and socialism, and also how you kind of see those two things as in a relationship today in the communist movement in Canada.
Sure. Yeah, so I mean that's interesting that you asked that, because I for many years, I first got involved with political and social activism through a faith organization when I was an undergrad here at University of Toronto, and so like many people, I was raised, many people in Canada anyway, I was raised within the church. In my case, it was one of the larger Protestant churches, and so even though I wasn't terribly active in my church, that still is, provided the frame of reference for a lot of how I understood what was right, what was wrong, what was good, what was bad, what I should do, what I shouldn't do, your role in life. And so when I came to U of T, there was a small organization, a student Christian organization that did a lot of social justice work. And I was attracted to them for that reason, that it was a narrative and an outlook that was familiar to me and that I still had some interest in. But at the same time, there was a real commitment to doing political and social activism. And that was also very interesting to me. And to me, it made complete sense that these weren't, that one flowed from the other, really. And so in my case, yeah, you're right. I went to Nicaragua a couple times and learned a fair bit about how the base community movement, I wasn't there for an extended period of time, but I was exposed to the base community movement, how it functioned during the revolutionary process in Nicaragua. And because I was there just after the Sandinista government had been voted out, I was also learning how they continued that progressive work, that with a transformative vision in a very different political climate. I also, I had the chance to read and study a number of liberation theologians. Both Latin American liberation theologians were probably the ones that were most commonly read at that time, Leonardo Boff and John Segundo, and others. But also a lot of feminist theology, which, is not homogeneous, right? There's a whole big range of writing in there. But that was also very interesting because it had a critical view of a lot of the institutions of mainstream church and mainstream theology. Mainstream, I guess, is the best word I can think of for it. At the same time, trying to, and I think doing a fairly reasonable job, approaching using that same narrative, in this case a Christian narrative, to develop and project a more liberative view either towards the poor or towards various towards nations or countries in Latin America, or towards women, or whatever, towards the environment. And so that was a very dynamic process to be involved with. It was really interesting to read a lot of that and learn and be able to do it within that framework that I was accustomed to, and B, which at the time, was very meaningful for me. It didn't seem to be two voices. It was one single voice, right? And I met a lot of people through that work who, a lot of older folks, for example, who'd been in the student Christian movement for many years, who were they were elderly when I met them, but they were really inspiring. They approached very radical social change and a very consistent and selfless commitment to building social change within their communities and internationally. They approached it out of their faith, and that was really, I learned a lot, but it was also very inspiring for me. In my case, so eventually I ended up, now I'm not a person of faith, but in my case, that wasn't because I counterposed socialism to Christianity. It was just at a certain point, my views sort of moved in a different direction, my worldview, away from a faith-oriented direction. But I would still argue that I carry a lot of the lessons and the perspectives that I was exposed to and that I learned and that I used in those times. Many of them still inform how I approach issues of organization within the party and currently even outside the party as well, of course. I think that, the comment that the person made to you that you can't be a real materialist or all atheists. And I've heard people say that before. And I mean, I suppose there is a point in the discussion where, you say, well, if matter precedes all consciousness, then, the question is, where does God come into this? And, I guess at that point, maybe there is some divergence of views, but it seems to me that that's so not the key issue. And that's a discussion that I don't even see why we need to approach that discussion. I mean, it is
very boring.
It is. It's boring, and it's sort of like the old, the angels on the head of a pin discussion, right? Where we're kind of nitpicking on theoretical points that I don't really think need to come into play, and really in a practical way don't come into play in the issues before us. I mean, when I was, involved in student Christian organizing, and when I was working with people who came out of the progressive wing, or progressive departments, I guess is maybe better, in progressive movements within the church and the ecumenical and the multi-faith movement, it wasn't like we sat around a table saying, well, okay, I have to translate their, faith-based approach to this problem into my materialist approach. No. I mean, we were talking about concrete analysis of concrete conditions, and it was, you just felt you were in a room full of comrades, to use that word. There was just we might have had different approaches to some of those things, but I mean, I have different approaches with people within the party, people take different approaches to things, and that's why we have, meetings and discussions. I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice, meaning that instead of having a preoccupation with are you an atheist or are you a believer or a faith-based person, the materialism sort of says, are we going to look at the conditions that are happening around us, try to figure out what's going on, try to figure out the best way to address them and to find a path that can build a movement to confront these and change them. I never felt that the Christians I was working with had any different approach than that. And so to me, there's miles and miles and miles of shared terrain in our shared struggles. And to me, that's what we need to focus on. And that's a basis for not just, it's a basis for unity. And I don't just mean in the sense that, well, we will work, I as Dave the commie will work with, Dean the Christian. It's that we can actually work together in similar organizations and in similar movements, assuming we're comfortable with that. I don't think we ever really, I can just not even think of a time when we need to get into that particular debate that was given, that the person raised to you about, well, how can you be a materialist if you believe in, a higher power or have a theistic approach or what have you. And it also, I think, betrays a really shallow knowledge of how people approach their own faith, right? I mean, I studied theology for a year, formally in a university setting in Ottawa, and there are many, many different methodological and theoretical approaches to Christian theology, and I'm sure there are the same in theologies of other religions as well. And I met all kinds of people who had just some really, really interesting and not off the wall approaches, but schools of thought that really did lend themselves to projecting or dwelling on people's individual agency. The agency of a human being, I think, is really what's important. And as I say, there's just so much common ground between a Marxist and a Christian and anybody of people of faith, people who are atheists, people who are agnostic. I mean, we all can take that political and organizational approach that we have in common, and I don't think out of that unless we want to be divisive and nitpicky, then we don't need to get into those things that divide us. There's just so much room to work and learn together, and so much that even as a person with a materialist approach to things, there's tons of issues that I can't explain. And so, that science hasn't explained. So however those get described, however those get formulated for different communities of people, I think it's really kind of a sad, divisive approach for people on the left generally to get into that nitpicky and that kind of argument. I just don't think is fruitful. I don't really think that's a communist or socialist approach to things, to be honest.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, me too. Well, to start wrapping this conversation up, Dave, I wonder if you could tell us if you think there's anything that Christians specifically can contribute to communist struggles in North America. It's like, there anything that we're particularly good at, maybe?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And in fact, just yesterday, I was reading through a biography of an ordained minister. His name was A.E. Smith. I think his first name was, he went by his initials, A.E. Smith. I think his first name was Albert. And he was an ordained Methodist minister in Canada who was also active in the Communist Party in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and I think into the 50s.
There you go, Matt. Matt teaches at a Methodist school.
Oh,
so I
what's
was looking for some Methodist heroes.
Yeah, we need them. We need all of them.
So it was kind of interesting. I didn't read his whole, I didn't get a chance to read the whole biography yet, but it's quite interesting because he talks about he very much approached communist politics from a point of view of his faith. There's just no question about that. It's not like he was taking party positions and then putting Methodist vocabulary around it. I mean, I think he really, genuinely approached the Communist Party and the fight for socialism as a religious person, as a Christian minister. And I think one of the things that you asked about a concrete contribution, and it sounds a little odd, but one of the things that does, I mean, we live in a society that is, generally not atheist. I mean, it's not, Canada's not necessarily a huge church-going society or synagogue-going society or whatever, but it's still, I think, a very, the dominant sort of soft ideology is still very much shaped by the parameters of that are very much shaped by, in particular, Christianity. And so one of the things that people of faith can help with in this struggle is when they get involved, they bring a certain sense of a moral justification for the work. It's not just, if I go out and say, well, here, based on my analysis as a materialist, yada, 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 yada. I mean, I wouldn't talk like that in public, but I mean, if, if I were to do that, there's often a hesitation for people to, because I'm using a point of view that they're not used to. Most people in Canada are not Marxists, and I guess probably most people in the United States, probably most people in the world are not Marxist or have even really got a strong familiarity with it. But a lot of people have a familiarity with a general Christian narrative or a biblical narrative about things. And so having different faith communities get engaged with struggles around Indigenous rights and justice, around the environment, around anti-racism. I mean, what this does is it helps bring some, a vocabulary or parameters for discussing it that more people are familiar with. So that in and of itself is enormously important. So you're helping to broaden the struggle. And incidentally, I don't mean that faith communities need to, take the Communist Party's view and then just shape it according to their own vocabulary. I mean, that like translate it. And no, I mean, I think there are lots and lots of faith communities that have a genuine faith-based approach to these issues. And when they do that, they tend to help broaden the discussion. They tend to help broaden the involvement of people. And it also brings, for a number of people, it brings a moral justification. A lot of people are guided by individual morality, and it helps them feel comfortable and feel confident, I guess, about being personally involved with what in some cases is a pretty long-term and thankless job, right? I mean, it can be pretty frustrating and people get burned out. And I guess that's the other thing is that for all of us, we all have our sort of, whether it's our particular narrative or a particular community that we are rooted in as political and social and economic activists, it can be very important just to have something that, a narrative that you can come back to that is liberative, that is transformative, and that gives you a new breath of air into your exhausted, tired lungs. You go out and you work and you work and you struggle and you try and you have meetings and you organize people and you take a lot of flack from people sometimes and you don't get to sleep in every weekend. And it's really important to have those different settings where people can have that breath of fresh air that rejuvenates us and carries us back in. And I know that different communities and different organizations, we all provide that to our members, and we all provide it in different ways. So the Communist Party provides it to our members one way, a church provides it to its members another way. But sometimes, and I've seen this, the way that those narratives get visited and revisited and used to help reinvigorate people, they can cross-pollinate. There are things, as I said, there are things that I learned when I was a Christian social justice activist that I find still really helpful in my work at the Communist Party right now as the Ontario leader. And similarly, I've when I've worked with, you cross-pollinate your approaches to these things, and that's really helpful. The other thing that's kind of interesting, I think, about a faith-based approach to social justice is because it's from a different, we'll have a lot in common for sure. We're spending all this time analyzing these concrete conditions, but often what grounds us and what guides some of our approaches is a bit different. Maybe it doesn't have to be different, but sometimes it is, or even just the way we describe the approach to the issues is different, and that can be really important because people learn in so many different ways. We communicate in so many different ways, and we have all kinds of different experiences, some that help inform us and some that, of course, become barriers to us learning. And I find that, we take on this massive task. It's exhausting and it's comprehensive. It's revolutionary, really. It is so big, the task that we set before ourselves. And it's so enormously important to have as many different voices helping us to comprehend what happens around us, helping us to deepen our understanding of issues. It helps. There's not, we say there's two sides to every story, but there's actually often there's 1,000 different sides to a story. And to hear those different sides to the story, or to hear those different approaches to the same side, can really help each one of us and all of us together to flesh out our analysis and come to positions of deeper unity and come to positions where we have stronger tactics and stronger commitment to those tactics. So I think those aren't all specific to what Christians can contribute, but I think that there really is a richness to the struggle and to the organizations in progressive struggle that can benefit from having a more open approach to each other sometimes, and certainly a more integrated approach to how we look at things. Even though at the end of the day, I'm a Marxist-Leninist, but as I say, that doesn't need to be a barrier. And there's probably, I know there's a lot more common ground than we often think of, and sometimes having those shared experiences really helps us to understand that common ground, and it opens it up for us.
So Christians can contribute to being Christians, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I mean, yeah, for sure.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that summarizes it well.
Cool. Well, thanks for spending so much time with us.
Thank you.
It's great to sit down and talk with people who are actually on the ground and organizing. And, I can speak from experience. The Communist Party of Canada is very kind and welcoming and fun to hang out with. So it's nice too to see, there is definitely a place for people of faith in a lot of leftist organizations. And hopefully people can kind of find what groups are out there, where they're at, and link up to them. That's a cool thing.
Definitely. And thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed this.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Thanks, Dave, for coming to the show. Appreciate that 100%. So if you're in Canada and looking for a great way to get involved, maybe check out the Communist Party of Canada. Go to a meeting. Go do karaoke with them.
It is very fun. Can speak from experience.
Also, as always, you should follow us on Twitter at The Magnificast. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to us on iTunes and SoundCloud. Those would all be very good and helpful. If you want to support The Magnificast financially, you can also support us on Patreon. Patreon.com/The Magnificast. All right. Thanks for listening.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. people don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would else are you gonna do?